Around 890 AD, a man named Othiri came to the court of a king. The king was Alfred of Wessex, known now as Alfred the Great. Othir was not a warrior, he was a merchant and an explorer from Hålogaland. This was the northernmost part of Norway, a land of long winters and dim light. He told the king about his life. He explained his business. Othir was a wealthy man in his own country. His wealth was not in gold coins, it was in animals. He owned 600 untamed deer. He called them reindeer. 6 of these were decoy deer, very valuable for catching wild ones. He also had 20 cattle, 20 sheep, and 20 pigs. He farmed a little, but his main business came from the north. It came from the tribute of the Finns, who we now call the Sami people. This tribute was his inventory. It consisted of animal skins: marten, reindeer, bear, and otter. It also included feathers for beds and cloaks. And it included a special product, walrus ivory, the tusks of the great seahorse, as they called it. These were as good as elephant ivory, sometimes better. He also got ropes from the hides of walruses and seals. He told King Alfred that a single rope, 60 ells long, was made from the hide of a walrus. It was the strongest rope in the world. Othir did not keep these goods. He sold them. He told the king about a journey he made. He wanted to know how far the land stretched to the north. And he wanted to find walruses. He sailed north along the coast for 3 days. The land was empty. Then he sailed east for 4 days. The land turned. Finally, he sailed south for 5 days. He reached a great river. He did not dare sail up it. The people there were hostile. His voyage was not for fame, it was for business, it was market research. He found the source of the walrus, he learned the shape of the coast. This knowledge was valuable. He then took his goods south. He sailed to a port called Syringashiel in Norway. From there, it was a 5-day sail to Hedeby. Hedeby was a massive trade hub at the base of the Danish peninsula. It connected the Baltic Sea to the North Sea. In Hedeby, Othiri's walrus ivory would be sold. It would travel down the rivers of Europe. It might end up as a carved cross in a German church, or a gaming piece on a nobleman's table in Francia. His furs would warm the shoulders of the rich. His strong ropes would rig the ships of other traders. Othir was a part of a vast network. He was a link in a chain that stretched from the frozen north to the warm markets of the south. His story, written down by a king's scribes, shows us a Viking. Not a raider with an axe, but a merchant with a plan. He was a master of a trade built on grit, knowledge, and the careful management of rare things. He was one of many. Their combined secrets made them the masters of commerce in a dark and fragmented age. Number 16, their fearsome reputation was also a form of brand recognition. Ivar the trader was not a large man. He did not have the build of a berserker. His arms were strong from the rudder and the rope, not the axe. But when he walked through the market at Jorvik in the year 895, people gave him space. They saw the Norse knotwork on his leather tunic. They saw the small silver hammer he wore on a cord around his neck. They saw the way he walked. He walked like he owned the ground he stood on. Because, in a way, his people did. Jorvik, what the English called York, was a Viking city. It was loud and smelled of wood smoke, mud, and roasting meat. Ivar had a stall near the River Ouse. He sold iron goods, not just nails and farm tools. He sold blades. He had knives with decorated bone handles. He had axe heads, polished and sharp. And he had a few swords. These were his prize items. One sword was special. It lay on a length of undyed wool. The blade had a pattern in it, like flowing water. It was a pattern welded sword, the work of a master smith. A customer, a local Anglo-Saxon landowner named Edric, picked it up. He was a nervous man. He had heard stories of men like Ivar's cousins, men who came with fire and steel, men who had taken the city. Edric tested the balance of the sword. It felt alive in his hand. The smith is a good one, Edric said, trying to sound casual. Well, Ivar nodded. He did not smile. He is a Frank. His name is Ulfbert, or he works for the man who uses that name. The steel comes from the mountains far to the south and east. It is better than anything you can make here. This was the truth. The Franks guarded their weapon-making secrets, but Vikings traded, and sometimes raided, for these superior blades. They became a status symbol. Owning one meant you were successful, it meant you were dangerous. Ivar knew this. He was not just selling a tool, he was, selling a piece of that danger. Edric looked at Ivar, he was buying a weapon from the very people he feared. The irony was not lost on him, but his old sword was soft iron. It had bent in his last skirmish with a rival neighbor. He needed something better, he needed an edge. The Vikings, for all their violence, represented quality in this one crucial area. Their reputation was built on the effectiveness of their steel. "How much?" Edric asked. Ivar named a price. It was high, 12 ounces of silver, enough to buy a small farm. Edric did not haggle. Haggling would be a sign of weakness, and he did not want to show weakness to this man. He reached into a pouch and pulled out a small set of scales. He began to place silver arm rings and chopped pieces of old brooches onto the dish. This was the business. The fear the Vikings inspired was a barrier. It kept people at a distance, but it also created a strange kind of trust, or a trust in their expertise with violence. When you bought a sword from a Norseman, you were buying a sword that worked. They would not use inferior weapons themselves, they would not sell them to others because their own lives depended on the quality of their gear. Their reputation as warriors guaranteed the quality of their merchandise. Ivar watched the silver pile up. He was not a raider, he had never burned a monastery, but the fear caused by those who did made his job easier. It meant fewer questions, it meant quicker sales, people did not want to cheat a Viking, they did not want to argue with one. The brand was fear, and fear was a powerful tool in commerce. Edric finished weighing the silver. It was the correct amount. So Ivar swept the pieces into his own pouch. He handed the sword to Edric. The deal was done. No pleasantries. Just a transaction. Edric walked away, the heavy sword in a new leather scabbard at his side. He felt more secure. He had bought a piece of the Viking menace to protect himself. Ivar watched him go. He then picked up another sword from under his table. It was almost identical. He placed it on the woolen cloth. He would sell this one too. His reputation and the reputation of his entire people preceded him. It was a shadow that walked before him. It opened doors. It closed mouths in the brutal marketplace of the 9th century. That was better than any letter of introduction. It was a secret of the trade, the most intimidating brand in the known world. Number 15, exploration was business development. Leif Erikson stood on the shore of a new land in the year 1001. The air was different here. It smelled of damp earth and green things he did not recognize. His father, Eric the Red, had found Greenland, a land of ice and rock, a marginal place to live. Leif had sailed west from Greenland, following a story from another sailor, Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course. Leif was not looking for glory, he was looking for resources. Greenland was poor, it had grass for animals. It had seals and walruses, but it had no trees. Every piece of wood for a house, a boat, or even a fire had to be imported from Norway. This was expensive and dangerous. A settlement without a local source of timber was a settlement that would always be on the edge of failure. Leif's primary mission was to find wood. His crew of 35 men pulled their Nar, their sturdy cargo ship, further up the beach. They built simple huts for the winter. Leif named the place Leif's Budir, Leif's Booths. He then divided his men. Every day one group would stay and work on the camp. The other group would explore. Their job was not to conquer, it was to survey, to act as scouts for a potential business venture. One of his men, a German named Turker, went missing one evening. They searched for him, worried. Turker had been with Leif's family for a long time. They found him later, excited, babbling in German. He had found something from his homeland, grapes, wild grapes growing on vines. They were small and sour, but they were grapes. He showed them how to press them. The men made a crude wine. Leif tasted it. It was not fine wine from Francia, but it was wine. And you could not make wine in Greenland or Iceland or even in most of Norway. Leif now had two valuable commodities. The first was timber. His men felled huge trees, maple, fir, and others they did not have names for. They cut them into logs and planks. They stacked the wood on the shore, ready for the trip home. The sheer size of the trees was a marvel. A single trunk from this new land was worth a fortune in treeless Greenland. The second commodity was the grapes, or the story of them. He named the land Vinland, the land of wine. This was not just a name. It was an advertisement. It was a prospectus. It promised a land of wealth and mild climate, a land that could support a thriving settlement. They spent the winter in Vinland. They gathered timber, they filled barrels with dried grapes, they charted the coastline, they noted the rich salmon runs in the rivers, they saw the abundance of game. This was not just an adventure, it was a detailed assessment of a new market and a new source of raw materials. Leif was not a king claiming territory, he was an entrepreneur assessing an opportunity. When spring came in 1002, they loaded their ship. It sat low in the water, heavy with Vinland timber. The hold was full of logs. More wood was lashed to the deck. They also had the dried grapes and samples of the local plants. Leif made a critical business decision. He would not just bring back the goods, he would bring back proof of their origin. The journey back was hard. But they made it to Greenland. When they arrived, the settlers were amazed. The timber was like gold. Leif sold it for a huge profit. He paid his crew well. He became known as Leif the Lucky, but it was not luck. It was calculated risk. It was exploration with a commercial purpose. The Vinland settlement he started did not last. Conflicts with the native people, the Skrælings, made it too dangerous. But the principle was sound. The Vikings pushed into the unknown not just for land or fame. They pushed into it looking for the next resource, the next market, the next trade route. Their voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland were the ultimate form of business development. They were searching for new assets to add to their vast commercial portfolio. Leif Erikson was not just an explorer, he was the head of a research and development mission for the family business. Number 14, they dealt in the most valuable commodity people. Rorik was a merchant from Birka, a thriving trade town on an island in Sweden. The year was 922. He was not on his ship. He was on foot, hundreds of miles from home. He was walking alongside a long line of people, connected by ropes around their necks. They were thralls, slaves, and they were his most profitable product. His journey had begun months earlier. He was part of a group of Swedes, men who called themselves the Russ. They had traveled east, across the Baltic, and into the network of rivers that crisscrossed the lands of the Slavs. They had a fort at a place called Aldeigeborg near Lake Ladoga. From there, they launched their ventures. Some of these ventures were trade. They brought Frankish swords and Scandinavian amber to exchange for furs and honey. But other ventures were more direct. They would paddle their shallow draft river boats, the Lodka, up a tributary. They would find a small Slavic village. The village was not well defended. The Rus came suddenly with swords and spears. Rorik did not enjoy this part of the business. It was loud and brutal, but it was effective. They would take what they could carry. Grain, preserved meat, and any silver they found. But the real prize was the people. They took the young and the healthy. Men, women, and children. They would be bound and marched back to the main river. This was the start of a long supply chain. At a larger Rus settlement, like Kiev, the thralls were sorted. Some were kept for labor. They would work the fields or serve the Rus chieftains. But the best ones were destined for export. These were the ones Rorik was now guarding. He had a group of 50. They were mostly young women and strong boys. These were the most valuable. The journey south was grueling. They traveled down the Dnieper River. They had to navigate dangerous rapids. At several points, they had to pull their boats from the water and carry them, along with all their cargo and thralls, for miles overland. The local tribes, like the Pechenegs, would often attack them at these portages. Rorik had lost men and thralls on previous trips. It was a high-risk business, but the rewards were immense. Their destination was the greatest city in the world, Constantinople. The Vikings called it Miklagard, the Great City, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Here, there was a huge market for slaves. The Byzantines needed servants, soldiers, and laborers. The caliphates further south, in Baghdad and Cordoba, were even richer markets. A strong young man could be sold as a guard. A beautiful young woman could be sold into a wealthy household. When they finally reached the Black Sea, they re-rigged their boats with sails for the final leg of the journey. Rorik's thralls were thin and exhausted. He had lost 3 to sickness on the way. That was a loss of profit, but it was expected. He made sure the remaining ones were fed well in the final days. They needed to look healthy for the market. In Constantinople, the Rus had a special arrangement. They were allowed to enter the city in groups of 50 unarmed. They were given lodging in a specific quarter, they received free food and access to baths for 6 months while they conducted their trade. This was the result of treaties signed after years of Rus attacks on the city. The Byzantines had found it was cheaper to trade with the Rus than to fight them. Rorik sold his thralls in the city slave market. He did not speak Greek. He used a translator. He sold a healthy boy for a length of Byzantine silk brocade. He sold a young woman for a bag of silver dirhams, coins from the Arab world that were a preferred currency. By the end of the week, all his thralls were sold. His pouches were heavy with silver, and his pack was full of silk. He had turned human lives into portable wealth. This was the dark secret at the heart of much of Viking commerce. The furs were valuable, the amber was desirable, the walrus ivory was exotic, but the slave trade funded many of their most ambitious expeditions. It was a brutal, ugly business, but for a merchant like Rorik, it was just business, the most profitable business of all. He would take his new wealth, travel back north, and begin the process all over again. Number 13, they planned for disaster. Astrid owned a share in a ship. Her husband Olaf was the captain. The ship was a nar, broad and deep, named the Sea Elk. It was the year 990, and the Sea Elk was loaded with wool from Iceland bound for Norway. It was a routine trip. They had made it many times, but the North Atlantic did not care about routine. The storm came on the 3rd day out. It was not a normal storm. The wind screamed. The waves were like moving hills. The Sea Elk was a good ship, built to be flexible. It twisted and groaned with each wave, its timbers held together by iron rivets and animal hair caulking. Olaf and his crew of 10 fought to keep the ship pointed into the wind. They reefed the single square sail down to a tiny patch. For 2 days they were tossed by the sea. They could not see the sun, they could not cook, they ate dried fish and drank stale water from their barrels. On the 3rd day of the storm, a huge wave crashed over the side. It snapped the mast. The heavy woolen sail and the thick timber yard crashed onto the deck. One of the crewmen, a young man named Finn, was crushed. The ship was now crippled. They had lost their main means of propulsion. The steering oar at the stern was damaged. They were adrift. Astrid, back in Iceland, knew this was a possibility. Every time Olaf sailed, she knew he might not return. This was a fact of life. But they did not simply hope for the best. They planned for the worst. This planning was built into their entire economic system. First, the ship itself was not owned by one person. Astrid and Olaf owned the largest share, a quarter of it. But the other 3/4 were owned by 8 other families in their community. The cargo of wool was owned in the same way. Each family had contributed a certain number of bales. This was risk management. If the Sea Elk was lost, no single family would be ruined. The loss would be spread across the community. It was a form of insurance woven into the fabric of their society. On the crippled ship, Olaf and his crew put their own disaster plan into action. They did not despair. They were sailors. They knew what to do. First, they cut away the wreckage of the mast and sail. They had to be careful not to puncture the hull. They used their axes, the same tools they used to build their homes. Every man on board was a farmer, a sailor, and a carpenter. Next, they assessed their situation. The steering oar was broken, but not beyond repair. They had spare timber and tools on board. Two men, the best woodworkers, immediately began to fashion a splint for the oar. Others worked on a jury-rigged mast. They used a long spare oar, one of the sweeps used for rowing in calm harbors. It was not tall, but it was strong enough to hold a small sail. They cut a piece of the wrecked sail and stitched it into a new, smaller shape. They rationed their water. They checked their food supplies. They had enough to last for a few weeks if they were careful. They knew their approximate position from the last time they had seen the sun. They knew the prevailing winds and currents. They were not saved, but they were not helpless. After a day of hard work, they had a functional steering oar and a small sail on a short mast. The ship moved slowly, but it moved. They could steer. They aimed east, towards Norway. The journey took another 3 weeks. It should have taken one. They ran low on food, they were exhausted. But they survived. When they finally sighted the coast of Norway, they were hailed as men returned from the dead. The news of their survival traveled back to Iceland on the next ship. Astrid felt relief, but not surprise. She had expected Olaf to fight his way back. The financial loss was significant. They had lost the mast and sail. Some of the wool cargo was damaged by salt water, but because the ownership was shared, everyone could absorb the loss. They would spend the next year building a new mast and repairing the ship. The families would pool their resources. The system worked. Viking trade was not about reckless gambling. It was about managing immense risk in a hostile environment. They did this through shared ownership, practical skills, and a culture of resilience. They knew that ships would sink, men would die, and storms would rage. They built their businesses with that knowledge at the very core. Disaster was not a possibility. It was an inevitability, and they planned for it. Number 12, they controlled the product from source to sale. Ottar was not his real name. It was the name he used in the south. In his homeland, in the far north of Norway, he was known by his Sami name. The year was 1050. Otter was a trader, but he was also a hunter. He was a middleman, but he stood at the very beginning of the supply chain. His business was fur, not the common wool for bear skins. He dealt in the finest furs in the world, ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat, and sable, a type of marten with dark, silky fur. These furs were incredibly valuable in the courts of Europe and the Middle East. Kings and bishops wore robes trimmed with ermine. Wealthy ladies coveted sable for its softness and warmth. But these animals were rare. They lived deep in the northern forests in the lands of the Sami people. The Norsemen who lived on the coast could not easily hunt them. They did not have the skills. They did not know the forest. The Sami did. They were master trappers and hunters. They moved silently on skis through the deep snow. They knew the habits of the animals. The Norse chieftain in the nearest fjord, a man named Harold, claimed lordship over this territory. He demanded tribute from the Sami. This was the system Othiri had described to King Alfred more than 150 years earlier. But the reality was more complex. It was a mix of tribute and trade. Odr was the one who made it work. He was Sami himself, but his family had traded with the Norse for generations. He spoke both languages. He understood both cultures. In the winter, he would travel with his family group, trapping and hunting. They would prepare the pelts with meticulous care. A single tear or imperfection could ruin the value of a sable skin. They stretched them, cleaned them, and bundled them. In the spring, Harald the chieftain would send his men to a prearranged meeting place. This was not a simple collection, it was a negotiation. Harold's men would bring goods the Sami needed. Iron axe heads, knives, salt, and wool cloth. These were things the Sami could not produce themselves. And Ottar was the lead negotiator for his people. He would inspect the iron goods. Was the quality good? Was the salt coarse or fine? He knew the value of his furs. He knew that a bundle of 10 sable pelts was worth a good quality iron sword. He would argue, barter, and finally agree on a price. Harald's men called it tribute. Ottar called it trade. Once the deal was done, the furs belonged to Harold. But Harold was not the final seller. He was just another link in the chain. He would take the furs south to the market at Nidaros, modern Trondheim. There, he would sell them to a merchant who owned a ship. This merchant was part of a larger network. The merchant, let's call him Bjorn, knew the international market. He knew that sable was in high demand in the Kievan Rus. He knew that ermine was prized in the German Empire. He would load his ship with furs, but also with other northern goods like dried cod and walrus ivory. Bjorn would sail his Nar across the North Sea to England or east into the Baltic. In a trade hub like Hedeby or Birka, he might sell the furs to another merchant, a Frisian or a Radonite, who had connections to the markets of Mainz or even Baghdad. With each sale, the price of the furs increased. This entire system was a Viking creation. They did not just buy goods at a market. They controlled the entire process. They used their power in their northern location to secure the source of the most valuable luxury goods. A chieftain like Harold used his military strength to control the Sasami hunters like Ottar. A merchant like Bjorn used his ship and his knowledge of sea lanes to move the product to market. And from the trapper's snare in the snowy forest to the shoulders of a queen in a distant castle, the Vikings managed the supply chain. They were not just raiders or farmers, they were vertically integrated international traders. They understood that true wealth came not just from selling a product, but from controlling it from the moment it was created to the moment it was sold to the final customer. The Ottar, the Sami hunter, was the first essential secret to this success. Number 11. They focused on high profit portability. Sigurd Falcon Nose was his nickname. He earned it. He lived on the west coast of Norway around the year 950. His farm was small, and the land was poor. He could not grow much grain. He had a few sheep, but Sigurd was a rich man. His wealth did not come from the land, it came from the sky. Sigurd was a falconer, not for sport, but for business. He specialized in capturing and training one specific type of bird, the gerfalcon. This was the largest and most powerful of all falcons. It bred on the remote cliffs of Norway, Iceland, and Greenland. It was a magnificent bird known for its strength and its pure white color. In the courts of Europe and the Arab world, falconry was the sport of kings. A powerful lord or a wealthy caliph would pay an enormous price for a top-quality hunting bird. A white gerfalcon from the north was the ultimate status symbol. It was like a modern luxury sports car. It was rare, beautiful, and a demonstration of immense power and wealth. Sigurd's business began in the late spring. He and his sons would sail their small boat to the nesting sites he knew. These locations were his trade secrets passed down from his father. They would watch the cliffs for weeks. They had to time it perfectly. They needed to take the young birds from the nest when they were old enough to survive, but before they had learned to fly and hunt for themselves. This was dangerous work. The cliffs were treacherous. The parent birds were aggressive. Once they had the young falcons, the real work began. They had to be trained. This took months of patience and skill. Sigurd was a master. He would keep the bird hooded at first, getting it used to his presence. He would feed it by hand, slowly. He would build a bond of trust with the wild creature. He would teach it to fly to his gloved fist, to chase a lure, and finally, to hunt other birds in the sky. A trained gerfalcon was a small, living package of immense value. It weighed only a few pounds. It was easy to transport. This was a key Viking trade secret focus on goods with a high value to weight ratio. You could fill a ship with timber or wool and make a profit. But you could carry a dozen trained falcons on the same ship and make 10 times that profit. Other high value, low bulk goods included walrus ivory, amber, and fine furs. But falcons were perhaps the most extreme example. In the autumn, when the birds were trained, Sigurd would be ready to sell. He would not sell locally. The real market was far to the south. He would travel to a major trading center, perhaps Hedeby in Denmark. Here, merchants from all over the world gathered. At Hedeby, Sigurd would meet a trader, a Dane named Ketil. And Ketil owned a larger ship. He had connections, he spoke a little bit of the Saxon language and a few words of Frankish. He would buy 4 of Sigurd's best falcons. The price was not paid in coin, it was paid in silver. Ketil would weigh out hack silver chopped up bracelets, rings, and coins on a small scale. For 4 birds, Sigurd received enough silver to support his family for 2 years. Kettle would then take the falcons on the next stage of their journey. He would sail down the coast and up the rivers of Francia. He might sell one falcon to a Frankish duke for a cask of wine and a bolt of fine red cloth. The wine and cloth he could then trade for a profit somewhere else. He might sell another bird to a Radhanite merchant, one of the Jewish traders who maintained networks that stretched all the way to Baghdad. This merchant would transport the falcon overland, a long and perilous journey. The bird, which started its life on a Norwegian cliff, might end up in the court of the Caliph of Cordoba in Spain. There, its price could be a fortune in gold dinars. Sigurd Falcon Nose never saw these places. He stayed in Norway. But he was the foundation of this global trade. He had the specialized skill to acquire and prepare a luxury product. He understood that the secret to getting rich was not to trade in everyday goods. It was to find something rare, something that the powerful and wealthy desired, and something that you could carry in your hand, but that was worth more than a whole wagon load of grain. A living bird was the perfect example of high-profit portability. Number 10. They understood the value of information. Solveig was not a sailor or a merchant. She was a weaver. She lived in Birka, the great trading town on Lake Mälaren in Sweden, around the year 870. Her husband, Eric, was a merchant. He was currently on a long journey east, along the river routes to the land of the Rus. He had been gone for almost a year. Solveig managed their household and their business in his absence. The arrival of a ship was the most important event in Birka. It was not just about the goods it carried. It was about the news. Information was a commodity as valuable as silver or silk, and the ships were the only way to get it. One afternoon in late summer, a lookout spotted a sail. The town stirred. People left their workshops and homes and gathered at the harbor. Solveig joined them. She recognized the ship. It was the Wave Runner, captained by a man named Finnbjorn. He had sailed to Hedeby and then to the coast of Frisia. He was a westbound trader. As the ship tied up, the questions began. Not just about prices. What was the mood in Hedeby? Were the Danes planning any new raids to the west? Was the king of the Franks strong, or were his lords fighting among themselves? A strong Frankish king meant the river tolls would be high, but the route would be safe. A weak king meant low tolls, but the risk of bandits was greater. Finnbjorn the captain was the center of attention. He sat on a coil of rope, drinking ale brought to him from the town. He answered the questions. He said silver from the Arab Caliphate was still flowing into Hedeby. That was good news for everyone. It meant the eastern trade routes, the ones Eric was on, were still profitable. He said the price of Frisian wool cloth was high because of a bad year for sheep. This was useful information for a weaver like Solveig, and it meant her own linen cloth would be more valuable. He also brought political news. A new Viking leader named Rollo was causing trouble on the River Seine in Francia. He was demanding land. This could disrupt the wine trade. Solveig made a mental note. The price of wine would likely go up. This was the Viking Information Network. It was not formal. It was a web of conversations, stories, and rumors carried by merchants from one port to another. A trader in Birka would know about the politics of the Byzantine Empire because a fellow Swede had just returned from serving in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople. A merchant in Dublin would know the price of walrus ivory in Jorvik because a ship had just made the crossing from England. This information allowed them to make smart business decisions. If they heard that a bad winter had destroyed the grain harvest in England, a merchant in Denmark might load his ship with surplus grain and sail west, knowing he could get a high price. If news came that the Pecheneg nomads were attacking caravans on the Dnieper River, a trader planning a trip to Miklagard might delay his journey or join a larger, more heavily armed group. Solveig listened for any news from the east. Finnbjorn had none. His world was the west, but a week later another ship arrived. This one came from the east, from the island of Gotland. The captain had spoken to traders who had just returned from Staraya Ladoga, the first major Rus fort on the river route. The captain told a story. He said the Khazars, who controlled the lower Volga River, were demanding higher taxes from the Rus traders. This was making it difficult to get silver from the Abbasid Caliphate through that route The Dnieper route to Constantinople was now the better option. This was vital information for Solveig. It meant her husband Eric, who was on the Dnieper route, was probably safe and doing good business. It also meant that the flow of Arab silver might slow down. Silver was the basis of their entire economy. Any disruption to its supply was a serious matter. Solveig went back to her loom. She had gathered more than gossip. She had gathered market intelligence. She knew which goods were rising in price. She knew which trade routes were safe and which were dangerous. She knew the political climate in distant lands. In an age without maps, newspapers, or fast communication, this knowledge was power. The Vikings' mastery of trade was not just about their ships or their courage. It was about their ability to listen, to share, and to act upon the information that flowed with them across the seas and down the rivers. They knew that the right story, heard at the right time, was worth more than a pouch full of silver. Number 9, they built trust with law. The argument was loud. Two men stood in the center of a circle of their peers. They were at the Althing, the great annual assembly in Iceland, in the year 1010. The ground they stood on was a wide, grassy plain, surrounded by volcanic cliffs. This was the center of their world, the place where laws were made and disputes were settled. One of the men was named Thorgils. He was a merchant. The other was named Gunnar. He was a farmer and ship owner. The dispute was about a trade deal that had gone wrong. Thorgils spoke first. He addressed the law speaker, a man who sat on a high rock, whose job it was to recite 1/3 of the law from memory each year. Thorgils explained that he had hired Gunnar's ship, the Fjord Serpent, to carry a cargo of wool and dried fish to Norway. They had agreed on a price 10% of the final sale value of the goods. This was a common arrangement, a form of partnership. But the journey had been a disaster. They were caught in a storm. To save the ship, Gunnar had ordered some of the cargo to be jettisoned. He had thrown 20 bales of Thorgils' best wool overboard. Thorgils was now demanding compensation. He claimed Gunnar had been negligent, that a better captain could have saved both the ship and the cargo. Then Gunnar spoke. He did not shout. He spoke calmly. He described the storm. He called on his crew members who stood in the crowd to support his story. They all agreed. The storm was ferocious. The choice was to lose some cargo or lose the entire ship and their lives. He argued that under the laws for sea voyages, a captain had the right to jettison cargo to save the vessel. He had not been negligent. He had made a hard choice, a choice that saved Thorgils' remaining cargo and Gunnar's ship. This was not a matter of swords or axes. It was a matter of law. The Vikings are often seen as lawless raiders, but among themselves they had complex legal systems. The Thing, or assembly, was the heart of this system. It was a place for all free men to gather, to make laws, and to resolve disputes publicly. This was crucial for commerce. And trade cannot happen without trust, and trust is built on a reliable system for enforcing agreements and settling conflicts. The law speaker listened to both sides. Other men in the assembly, respected chieftains and wealthy farmers, also spoke. Some had experience in similar situations. They discussed previous cases. They were building a body of legal precedent. One older man, a veteran merchant named Ulf, stood up. He proposed a compromise, one based on a principle known as the general average. This was a concept in maritime law, perhaps learned from Frisian or Roman traders. The idea was that the loss of the jettisoned cargo should be shared by all the parties who had benefited from the sacrifice. That included Gunnar, the ship owner, and Thorgils, the owner of the remaining cargo. The ship was saved. The rest of the goods were saved. Everyone should contribute to cover the loss of the wool that was sacrificed. The assembly considered this. It seemed fair. It was a way to resolve the dispute without anyone losing face or feeling cheated. Thorgils would not get full compensation, but he would not bear the entire loss alone. Gunnar would have to contribute, but his reputation as a captain would be intact. The law speaker finally gave his judgment. He agreed with Ulf's proposal. He cited the relevant section of the law, the Gragas or Grey Goose laws. He detailed how the value of the lost wool should be assessed and how the loss should be divided proportionally among the value of the ship and the value of the cargo that was saved. Thorgils and Gunnar both accepted the ruling. They shook hands. The dispute was over. They would do business together again. The system had worked. It had provided a predictable and fair way to handle a commercial disagreement. This legal framework was a powerful trade secret. It allowed Vikings to make complex deals with confidence. A merchant in Iceland could entrust his goods to a ship captain he barely knew because he trusted the system of law that stood behind their agreement. This system, replicated in things all across the Viking world, from Norway to Dublin to the Isle of Man, was the invisible infrastructure that supported their vast trading network. And it replaced violence with verdicts and feuds with fines. It built the trust that is the essential foundation of all successful commerce. Number 8. Raiding was just aggressive capital acquisition. Asbjorn was 18 years old in the summer of 845. He was standing on the deck of his uncle's longship. It was one of over 100 ships sailing up the River Seine. This was his first raid. He was nervous, but also filled with a fierce excitement. He had grown up on stories of raids like this, stories of glory, and more importantly, of wealth. In his home village in Denmark, there was a clear path to becoming a successful man. You could inherit a farm, you could try to become a merchant, but both of these required capital. You needed land or you needed a ship and goods to trade. Asbjorn's family had a small farm, not enough to support him and his brothers. He had no silver to invest in a trading voyage. Raiding was his way into the economy. It was how a young man with nothing but a strong sword arm could acquire the starting capital for his future. The fleet was commanded by a leader named Ragnar. He was daring and smart. He had chosen his target well, Paris, a rich city, the heart of the kingdom of the West Franks. It was on an island in the river, but Ragnar was not intimidated. The Franks sent an army to stop them. Asbjorn watched from the ship as the Viking warriors formed a shield wall on the riverbank and defeated a division of the Frankish army. They took over 100 prisoners. Then Ragnar did something that was both brutal and a calculated act of psychological warfare. He hanged all the prisoners on an island in the river, in full view of the remaining Frankish soldiers. It was a message to the Frankish king, Charles the Bald. It said, "We are serious and we are not afraid of you." The Frankish army retreated. The path to Paris was open as Bjorn and the other raiders plundered the city's monasteries and churches. They were not attacking the Christian religion, they were attacking the banks. In the 9th century, monasteries were the wealthiest and least defended places in Europe. They were full of gold chalices, silver plates, and embroidered silk vestments. Asbjorn took a silver cross studded with rough gems. He found a cask of wine. He took a Frankish sword better than his own. It was chaos, but it was organized. The leaders ensured that the most valuable plunder was gathered together for later distribution. The raid was not just about smashing and grabbing. It was a negotiation. After looting the city, Ragnar did not leave. He stayed. King Charles the Bald, unable to defeat the Vikings militarily, chose to pay them to leave. This payment was called the Danegeld. Charles paid Ragnar's army 7,000 French livres. This was an enormous sum equivalent to about 2,570 kilograms of silver and gold. When the fleet returned to Denmark, the wealth was divided. Asbjorn received his share. It was not a huge fortune, but it was more silver than he had ever seen in his life. He had a bag of hacksilver, pieces of chopped up Frankish jewelry and coins. He had his new sword. He had survived. He was now a man of means. This is the secret. Raiding and trading were not two different professions. They were two sides of the same coin. Raiding was the primary method of acquiring capital. That capital, in the form of silver, slaves, and high-value goods, was then used to fund trading expeditions. With his share of the Danegeld, Asbjorn now had options. He could buy a small piece of land, or he could do what his uncle did. He could invest his silver in a legitimate business venture. The next year, his uncle was planning a trading trip to Hedeby. He was buying a cargo of Norwegian soapstone bowls to sell to the Saxons. He needed investors to help him buy the goods and provision the ship. Asbjorn invested his silver. He became a partner in the voyage. He was no longer just a raider. He was a merchant. When the voyage was successful, Asbjorn got his investment back, plus a share of the profits. He used this new wealth to buy a share in his uncle's ship. Over the years, he went on more raids, and he invested in more trading ventures. The line between the two blurred. Sometimes, a fleet would set out with two goals to raid one town, and then to trade peacefully with the next one down the coast. It all depended on the circumstances. Was the town well defended? Was the local lord willing to trade? This pragmatic approach was the key. Raiding was not mindless violence. It was a brutal, high-risk, but often highly effective economic strategy. It was the Viking equivalent of a startup incubator generating the initial wealth that fueled their entire commercial empire. And for a young man like Asbjorn, a bloody raid on Paris was his first step on the ladder to becoming a respected merchant. Number 7, they knew when to fight and when to befriend. The year was 911. A Viking leader named Rollo had been raiding the coast of Francia for years. He and his men were a persistent problem for the Frankish king Charles the Simple. They had sailed up the Seine River repeatedly, sacking towns and demanding payment to leave. The king's armies could not defeat them. King Charles decided to try a different strategy. He could not beat the Vikings, so he decided to make a deal with them. He sent an archbishop to meet with Rollo. The offer was radical. Charles would give Rollo and his men a huge territory of land in the north of Francia. It was the land around the mouth of the Seine. In return, Rollo had to do two things. He had to stop raiding the rest of Francia, and he had to defend the river from any new groups of Vikings that might try to attack. Rollo listened to the offer. He was a raider, a warrior, but he was also a politician. He was in his 60s. Perhaps he was tired of a life spent on a ship. He saw the opportunity. The land was rich farmland. It was a strategic location for controlling trade. He could become a lord, a ruler. He could have a future for his people that was more than just plunder. He agreed to the deal. There was one condition. He had to be baptized as a Christian and swear fealty to King Charles. This was a sticking point for many of his men. They believed in Odin and Thor, but Rollo was a pragmatist. He saw that adopting the religion and customs of the Franks was the price of acceptance. It was a business decision. He agreed. So Rollo and his leading men were baptized. The territory they were given became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo became its first duke. This was a perfect example of the Viking ability to adapt. For decades, they had used fighting as their primary tool to get what they wanted. But when fighting reached its limits, they were willing to switch tactics. They became friends, or at least allies, with their former enemies. This assimilation was not a surrender. It was a strategy for long-term success. The Normans in France did not forget they were Vikings, but they also learned from the Franks. They adopted the Frankish language, which evolved into the Norman dialect. They adopted Frankish feudalism and military techniques, especially the use of heavy cavalry. They intermarried with the local population. Within a few generations, Rollo's descendants were powerful French dukes. They were Christians who built great churches and monasteries. But they still had the Viking spirit of adventure and ambition. In 1066, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, would use Normandy as a base to launch his invasion of England. The same pattern of adaptation happened in other places. In Ireland, Vikings founded the city of Dublin. At first, they were foreign raiders, but over time they became the Hiberno-Norse. They intermarried with the Irish. They became a part of the local political and economic landscape. They controlled the sea trade, connecting Ireland to a wider world, but they also adopted Irish art styles and customs. In Russia, Swedish Vikings known as the Rus traveled down the rivers. They started as traders and mercenaries, extorting tribute from the local Slavic tribes. But they stayed. A leader named Rurik founded a dynasty in Novgorod. His successor Oleg moved the capital to Kiev. The Rus elite ruled over a Slavic population. Over time, they adopted the Slavic language and customs. They became the rulers of the first Russian state, Kievan Rus. Their Viking origins were remembered, but they had become something new. This was one of their most important trade secrets. They were not rigid, they were flexible, they knew when to use the axe and when to offer a handshake. They knew when to fight and when to marry into the local elite. They understood that the best way to control a market in the long run was not always to conquer it, but to become a part of it. This ability to assimilate, to change their identity, to suit the circumstances, allowed them to turn temporary raids into permanent and powerful settlements that shaped the future of Europe. Number 6, they built their own markets. In the early 9th century, the coast of southern Jutland, in what is now Germany, was a quiet place. There was a small settlement at the end of a long navigable inlet called the Schlei. It was a good, sheltered harbor, but it was not yet a city. Then, in the year 808, a Danish king named Godfred did something remarkable. He attacked a rival trading town of the Slavs called Rarik. He did not just loot it, he destroyed it completely. And he forcibly relocated all the merchants from Rarik to his own territory, to that small settlement at the head of the Schlei. He named it Hedeby. This was not an act of random violence, it was a calculated act of economic policy. Godfred understood that trade was power. He did not want to just participate in the existing trade networks. He wanted to control them. By destroying his rival and capturing its most valuable asset, its merchants, he created an instant trading superpower. Hedeby was built for business. It had a unique and strategic location. It sat at the narrowest point of the Jutland Peninsula. From the harbor, goods could be unloaded from ships that had come from the Baltic Sea. Then, they could be transported just 10 miles overland to the Treen River, which flowed into the Eider River, and then into the North Sea. This short portage, the Hedeby shortcut, allowed traders to avoid the long and dangerous sea voyage around the northern tip of Denmark. It was a vital link between the two great trading zones of northern Europe. The Vikings did not just choose a good location. They engineered a city. They built a massive semi-circular earthwork wall to protect the landward side of the town. They built a system of wooden jetties and piers into the harbor, creating a state-of-the-art port facility. The town itself was laid out on a grid plan with plots of land divided by wattle fences. It was a planned urban development. A visitor to Hedeby in the year 965, a merchant from the Arab Caliphate of Cordoba named al-Tartushi, left a famous description of the town. He was not impressed by the wealth of the inhabitants. He said they ate fish and were generally poor. He complained about the terrible singing of the locals, but he was amazed by the sheer scale of the trade. The town was crowded with merchants from all over the world. There were Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians. There were Slavs, Saxons, and Frisians. He saw goods from everywhere: pottery from the Rhineland, whetstones from Norway, glassware from Francia, amber from the Baltic coast, and silver coins from Samarkand. Hedeby was not an accident. It was a purpose-built commercial machine, and it was not the only one. Across the Viking world, they founded and developed key trading towns. In Sweden, Birka, on the island of Bjorko, became the key hub for the eastern trade into Russia. In Norway, Kaupang was a major seasonal market. When the Vikings expanded overseas, they did the same thing. They took the small English settlement of Eoforwick and transformed it into the bustling industrial and commercial capital of Jorvik. They founded Dublin in Ireland, which became the most important slave market and trade hub in the British Isles. These towns were the engines of the Viking economy. They were places where raw materials from the north, like furs and ivory, could be exchanged for finished goods from the south, like wine, pottery, and weapons. They were melting pots of cultures and languages. They were centers of craft and industry. Archaeologists in Hedeby have found evidence of glass bead making, iron working, and comb making from antler. The secret was that the Vikings did not just wander from one market to another. When a market did not exist in the perfect location, they built one. They understood the importance of infrastructure. They knew that to control trade, you needed to control the nodes of the network, the ports, the towns, the marketplaces. King Godfred's brutal but brilliant decision in 808 to create Hedeby by force set the pattern. They were not just participants in the economy of the Dark Ages. They were its architects. Number 5, they saw rivers as highways, not barriers. For a Roman legionary or a Frankish knight, a river was an obstacle. It was something to be crossed with a bridge or a ferry. It was a defensive line. For a Viking, a river was a road. It was an invitation. The key was their technology. The Viking longship is famous for its use in sea raids, but its design made it the perfect tool for riverine travel. It had a very shallow draft. A fully loaded ship could float in just a few feet of water. This meant it could travel far upriver, long after a deeper hulled ship from the Mediterranean would have run aground. The ships were also long, narrow, and light. This made them fast, and it made it possible to move them over land. This last part was crucial. It was the secret to their eastern expansion. 2 great river systems flowed through the vast lands of Eastern Europe. The Volga flowed south to the Caspian Sea, a route to the silver mines of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Dnieper flowed south to the Black Sea, a route to the riches of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire. But these 2 river systems were not connected. Between them lay a watershed, a stretch of land. In the early 9th century, Swedish Vikings, known as the Rus, began to exploit this geography. A group of them, led by a man we might call Sven, would start their journey in a place like Birka. They would sail their ships, laden with trade goods like furs and amber, across the Baltic Sea and into the Gulf of Finland. They would navigate up the Neva River to Lake Ladoga. There, near the modern town of Staraya Ladoga, they established one of their first major settlements, Aldegeborg. This was their forward base. From here, the real work began. They would travel up the Volkhov River, a tributary of Lake Ladoga. The river had rapids. Here, the crew would get out of the boat. Some would stay in the water, guiding the ship between the rocks. Others would be on the shore, pulling the ship with ropes. It was slow, backbreaking work. After the rapids, they would reach Lake Ilmen and the town of Novgorod, another major Rus center. From here, they would travel down the Lovat River. Then came the most difficult part of the journey. The Lovat River petered out. To get to the Dnieper system, they had to move their ships overland. This was the portage. They would unload the cargo, then using logs as rollers and sheer muscle power, they would drag their ships, each weighing several tons, through the forest and swamp for miles. It was a monumental feat of engineering and endurance. Local Slavic tribes were often employed to help with the labor. Once they reached the upper Dnieper, the journey became easier again for a while. They would paddle and sail downstream past settlements that would become cities like Smolensk and Kiev. Kiev became their capital, the center of the Kievan Rus state, but the Dnieper also had its own dangers. Well, further south, there was a series of 7 major rapids. Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII wrote a detailed description of these rapids in the 10th century. He gave them both their Rus and Slavic names. At each rapid, the Rus had to repeat the portage process, but this time under the threat of attack from Pecheneg nomads who controlled the steppes. They would post armed guards while the others carried the cargo and dragged the ships. Once past the rapids, it was a clear run to the Black Sea. They would raise their sails and head for the ultimate prize, Constantinople, or Miklagard. This entire journey, over 1,000 miles long, was made possible by their unique ships and their view of the landscape. They saw the river systems not as separate entities, but as a single, interconnected network of water highways. The small stretches of land between them were just inconvenient tolls to be overcome with strength and determination. This mastery of the river systems gave them a virtual monopoly on the trade route between Northern Europe and the rich empires of the East. You know, it was this trade in slaves and furs that brought the vast hordes of Arab silver dirhams back to Scandinavia, fueling the entire Viking Age. They had turned the geography of Eastern Europe, which others saw as a barrier, into their single greatest commercial asset. The rivers were their secret roads to wealth. Number 4, they never relied on a single product. Olaf Tryggvason, who would one day be a king of Norway, was a young man in the late 10th century. His early life was one of constant movement and trade, and he lived for a time in the Kievan Rus at the court of Vladimir the Great. From there, he operated as a merchant and a mercenary in the Baltic region. A manifest for one of his trading voyages from this period, if it existed, would show the secret of Viking commercial resilience diversification. Let's imagine Olaf's ship, a small nar, ready to leave the Rus port of Novgorod. The main cargo, stored deep in the hold, might be beeswax. The forests of the Rus were full of wild bees. The local Slavic tribes collected the wax, which was in high demand all over Europe. It was used to make candles for churches and monasteries. It was a bulk commodity, not glamorous, but a steady seller. Next to the beeswax would be bundles of fur. Not the highest quality sable, which would be sent south to Constantinople, but good, serviceable squirrel and marten pelts. These were for the markets in England and Francia, where they would be used to line the cloaks of the middle class. On top of these bulk goods would be the more valuable items. A locked chest might contain several pounds of amber. This gold of the north was gathered along the southern coast of the Baltic. It was highly prized for jewelry and ornaments. Olaf had traded for it at a market in the territory of the Prussians. But Olaf was not just a merchant of raw materials. He was also a dealer in finished goods. His ship would carry finely crafted wooden bowls made from the burls of birch trees. He might have a dozen barrels of honey, another product of the northern forests, and crucially, he would be transporting people. A small group of thralls, captured in a recent skirmish with a rival chieftain, were kept under guard in the bow of the ship. They were destined for the slave market in Hedeby. His ship was a portfolio of investments. Some were low-risk, steady earners, like the beeswax. Others were high-risk, high-reward, like the thralls. If the price of fur was low in Hedeby that year, the price of amber might be high. If one product failed, the others would cover the loss. This diversification was a fundamental principle of Viking trade. A merchant leaving Norway for Iceland would not just carry timber, he would also carry iron bars, grain, and beer. On the return journey, his ship would be loaded with Icelandic wool, dried fish, and perhaps a few trained gerfalcons for the luxury market. Consider the economy of the Greenland settlement founded by Eric the Red. It was a marginal existence. But they survived for centuries by developing a diverse export business. Their main product was walrus ivory. The tusks and skulls of walruses from the Greenland hunting grounds were shipped to Europe to be carved into luxury goods. They also exported the thick, strong ropes made from walrus hide, which were considered the best in the world for rigging ships. And they exported live polar bears as gifts for European kings, and they exported narwhal tusks, which were often sold as the horns of the mythical unicorn for an astronomical price. They could not grow much, but they found a range of unique, high-value products to trade for the things they needed, like grain and iron. This strategy was a form of risk management. It protected them from market fluctuations, political instability, and environmental disasters. If a new trade route opened up that made Frankish pottery cheaper, a Viking merchant could simply shift his focus to selling English wool. If a war in the east disrupted the flow of Arab silver, they could increase their raiding and trading in the west. They were not specialists, they were generalists. A Viking merchant was a dealer in anything that could be bought and sold. They were opportunistic and adaptable. A man like the young Olaf Tryggvason saw the world as a web of opportunities. His ship was not a vessel for carrying one type of good. It was a floating warehouse, a mobile marketplace, carrying a carefully balanced selection of products designed to maximize profit and minimize risk. They never put all their silver in one venture. That was a secret that kept them in business for 300 years. Number 3, they created a universal currency. Ibn Abbas was a silversmith in Baghdad in the year 903. He was melting down a coin. It was a silver dirham issued by the Samanid dynasty in Central Asia. The coin was thin and wide, covered in elegant Arabic script. It proclaimed the greatness of Allah and named the current caliph. For Adbas, it was money. It had a set value. He knew exactly what he could buy with it. Thousands of miles away, in a Viking settlement on the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, a woman named Helga was also holding a Samanid dirham. But she could not read the script. She did not know the name of the caliph. For her, the coin was not money in the same way. It was bullion, it was a piece of silver, its value was based purely on its weight and purity. Helga took the coin and a small, sharp chisel. She placed the coin on a block of wood and cut it in half. Then she cut one of the halves in half again. She now had 3 pieces of silver, a half coin, and 2 quarter coins. She took these pieces, along with a collection of other silver fragments, a piece of a bracelet, a flattened silver ingot, the head of a broken brooch, and put them in a leather pouch. This was her wallet. Later that day, she went to the market. She wanted to buy a new clay pot from a trader who had just arrived from the Rhineland. The trader wanted 40 grams of silver for the pot. Helga took out her small set of bronze balance scales. These scales were one of the most important tools of a Viking trader. She placed a set of lead weights, carefully marked with dots to show their mass, on one side of the scale. On the other side, she began to place her silver fragments, a bit of the bracelet, the half dirham, one of the quarter dirhams. It was still not enough. She took a small silver wire and snipped a piece off with pliers. She added it to the scale. Finally, the 2 sides balanced, the deal was done. This was the hack silver economy. It was the Vikings' great financial innovation. They operated across dozens of different cultures, each with its own coins and systems of value. The Anglo-Saxons had their silver pennies. The Franks had their deniers. The Arabs had their dirhams. A Viking merchant could not possibly keep track of all the different exchange rates. So they created their own system. They treated all forms of silver coins, jewelry, ingots as a raw material. Its value was determined by 2 things: its weight, which they could measure with their scales, and its purity. They became expert metallurgists, able to assess the quality of silver by its color, its feel, and by making a small nick in it to see the metal underneath. This system was incredibly flexible. It allowed them to trade anywhere, with anyone. An Irish brooch could be chopped up and used to buy furs from a Sami hunter in the far north. An Arab coin could be combined with a piece of a Frankish chalice to pay for a sword in Hedeby. It turned all silver into a single universal currency. Archaeologists have found thousands of these Viking hoards. The Quairdale hoard, found in England, contained over 8,600 items, including coins from all over Europe and the Islamic world, as well as over 1,000 ounces of hack silver. The Galloway hoard in Scotland contained a silver gilt vessel from Central Asia filled with ingots and arm rings. These hoards are a physical record of the Vikings' global reach and their unique economic system. They also standardized their weights. Across the Viking world, from Russia to Ireland, archaeologists find the same type of small decorated lead weights. They were based on a unit of about 4.25 grams, which was likely derived from the weight of the Islamic dirham. This meant a merchant from Sweden could conclude a deal with a merchant from Norway with confidence because they were both using the same standardized system of measurement. This creation of a universal currency and a standardized system of weights was a revolutionary act. In an age of fragmented kingdoms and competing standards, the Vikings built a simple, practical, and trustworthy system for conducting international trade. It was a secret hidden in plain sight. Value is not in the image on the coin, but in the metal itself. By cutting up the coins of kings and caliphs, they were declaring that, in their world, the only authority that mattered was the unblinking judgment of the balance scale. Number 2, they mastered the sea itself. Hrafna Floki Vilgerdarsson was a Norwegian Viking of the 9th century. His name means Raven Floki. He earned it on the voyage that made him famous. He was not a merchant in the traditional sense. He was an explorer. But his journey illustrates the fundamental technology that underpinned all Viking success, their mastery of navigation. Floki had heard stories of a large island in the west known as Gardarsholmi. He decided he would find it and settle there. In the year 868, He set out from western Norway. He sailed first to the Shetland Islands, then to the Faroe Islands. From the Faroes, he faced his real challenge, hundreds of miles of open, featureless ocean. How do you navigate in a world without a magnetic compass? This was the problem that Viking sailors solved. They had a set of tools and techniques, both simple and brilliant. Their primary tool was the sun. On a clear day, they could use the sun's position to get a rough idea of east and west. At noon, the sun is at its highest point in the sky. In the northern hemisphere, this point is due south. A sailor could observe the shadows cast by the mast of the ship. When the shadow was at its shortest, it was noon, and the shadow pointed due north. This gave them a fixed bearing once a day. They likely used a simple device, a version of a sun compass. Archaeologists found a fragment of a wooden disc at Artok in Greenland. It has a series of carved lines. By placing a pin in the center, the device could be used to track the sun's shadow and find the cardinal directions. It could also be used to determine latitude. By measuring the length of the noon shadow at different times of the year, a skilled navigator could figure out how far north or south he was. This allowed them to sail west along a specific line of latitude, a technique called latitude sailing. This is how they reliably found Iceland and Greenland. But what about cloudy days? The North Atlantic is famous for its fog and low clouds. This is where Floki's ravens came in. Before leaving the Faroes, he had taken 3 ravens on board. After sailing for some time, he released the first raven. The bird flew up, circled, and then headed straight back towards the Faroes. Floki knew he was still closer to the land he had left than to any new land ahead. He sailed on. A day or two later, he released the second raven. This one flew up, circled for a while, and then landed back on the ship. This meant it could not see land in any direction. They were truly in the open ocean. Floki continued to sail west. Finally, he released the third raven. This bird flew up into the air and then headed purposefully to the northwest. Floki knew the raven had spotted land that was still below the horizon for the men on the ship. He ordered his crew to change course and follow the raven. Soon, they sighted the high, ice-covered mountains of a vast new island. This is how, according to the Landnámabók, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, Floki found Iceland. Besides the sun and birds, navigators used other clues. They understood the patterns of ocean swells. Long, regular waves are generated by distant storms. Their direction can indicate the direction of the wind hundreds of miles away. They observed the migratory patterns of whales and birds. They could spot water sky, the reflection of ice sheets on the underside of clouds, to find lands like Greenland from a great distance. There is also the legend of the Solarstein, the sunstone. This was said to be a type of crystal that could show the position of the sun even on a cloudy day. The sagas mention it. Scientists have shown that certain crystals, like cordierite, found in Scandinavia, can polarize light. By holding the stone up and rotating it, you can find the direction of the sun even when it is obscured by clouds. While no sunstone has ever been definitively identified in a Viking grave, the science is plausible. Floki's first attempt to settle Iceland was a failure. He was not prepared for the harsh winter, and his livestock died. He named the island Iceland in his disappointment and returned to Norway, but others followed him, using the same navigation techniques. They succeeded. This total mastery of the sea was the ultimate Viking trade secret. Their ships gave them the ability to travel, but their navigation skills gave them the confidence to leave the coastline behind. They could cross vast stretches of open water. This opened up new lands for settlement and new direct trade routes. It was a technological and intellectual advantage that no other European people of the age possessed. It allowed them to build a network that connected continents, all guided by the sun, the stars, and the flight of a bird. Number 1, the right tool for the job. In the year 1025, a man named Thorir Hund, a powerful chieftain from northern Norway, prepared for a trading expedition. He was not going raiding. He was going on a long, difficult journey north and east into the White Sea to trade for furs with the people of Bjarmaland. This was a business trip, and for this trip he would not use a longship. The longship with its dragon head and rows of shields is the famous image of the Viking Age. It was a masterpiece of naval design. It was long, narrow, and fast. It was a troop transport, a warship. It was designed to carry warriors across the sea at speed, to strike quickly, and to leave just as fast. It was perfect for raiding, but it was not perfect for trade. For his journey to Bjarmaland, Thorir chose a different kind of vessel. He chose a nar. The nar was the workhorse of the Viking Age. It was the cargo ship, the freighter, and it was just as important to the Viking success as the longship, if not more so. The design of the nar was different. It was shorter than a longship, but much wider and deeper. It had a much rounder hull. This made it slower, but it also made it much more stable in the rough seas of the North Atlantic. And most importantly, it could carry a huge amount of cargo. A typical nar could carry 24 tons of goods. Some of the larger ones could carry even more. The nar also had a different crew setup. A longship needed a large crew, one man for each oar, perhaps 60 to 80 men. The nar was designed to be sailed by a very small crew. It relied almost entirely on its single large square sail. The crew might be as small as 8 to 15 men. This was a crucial economic advantage. Fewer men meant lower costs for wages and provisions. And more space for cargo meant higher potential profits. The nar was built using the same clinker-built method as the longship, with overlapping planks held together by iron rivets. This made the hull strong but flexible, allowing it to bend and twist with the waves rather than breaking. But unlike a longship, which had open decks, the nar often had a raised deck in the bow and stern, and a partially covered cargo hold in the middle. This offered better protection for the goods from salt water and rain. Thorir Hund's journey, as told in Heimskringla, the saga of the Norwegian kings, was a joint venture. He partnered with other chieftains. They loaded their nar with goods. The Bjarmalanders wanted grain, cloth, and probably iron tools. They sailed north, around the North Cape, a dangerous and difficult passage. When they reached Bjarmaland, they traded peacefully. They filled the hold of their nar with valuable furs, squirrel, beaver, and sable. The voyage was a great success. They made a huge profit. This is the secret that is often overlooked. The Vikings succeeded because they had specialized tools for specialized tasks. They did not use a warship for a trade mission. They used a ship that was designed from the keel up for commerce. The nar was the ship that carried the dried cod from Norway to England. It was the ship that carried the wool from Iceland and the walrus ivory from Greenland. It was the ship that moved the timber and the slaves and the barrels of wine. It was the foundation of their entire trading empire. The best evidence for this comes from the shipwrecks found at Skuldelev in Denmark. In the 11th century, 5 Viking ships were deliberately sunk to block a channel. When they were excavated in the 1960s, archaeologists found 2 longships, a smaller coastal trader, a fishing boat, and a large, magnificent nar. This ship, known as Skuldelev 1, was a classic ocean-going cargo vessel. It was built of pine in western Norway. It had been repaired many times with oak and linden wood, showing it had a long and hard-working life. It was this ship, and thousands like it, that truly made the Vikings the master merchants of their age. They understood that you do not use a racehorse to pull a plow, you do not use a sword to chop wood, and you do not use a warship to carry cargo. They had the right tool for war, and they had the right tool for the job of getting rich.